So just to recap, DUKPT stands for Derived Unique Key Per Transaction. It is a key management scheme, encryption keys. It is based on the idea that on a payment terminal, every transaction should have unique keys that will encrypt the payload. And once those keys are done with the encryption, they need to be discarded. So the obvious question from this is, if the device encrypts every transaction with unique keys, how does the backend know what key was used for a specific transaction? So there's something called a key loading process. Basically, you have the payment processing company, and then you have the acquirer, which is the bank. So they come together in a room and they share some keys. They come up with the master key, and that key is called the BDK, or the base derivation key. And it is the key from which all the other keys are derived. This key is loaded into this device, and this device is called the HSM, or the hardware secure module, also known as the key loading device. Now, when the keys are loaded into the payment terminal, it is not the BDK itself. So the HSM loads on the payment terminal something called the initial key, or the IPAC, which is the initial pin encryption key. When that key is loaded on this terminal, the terminal generates something called future keys from that IPAC. And as soon as the future keys are generated, it discards the IPAC completely. The future keys are the actual keys from which the working keys, which are the keys that will be actually used to encrypt the transaction, are derived. There is something called the KSN, also known as the key serial number. It is a piece of string that represents three things. It is kept on the device. The first part, the BDK ID, which is the identifier of the BDK. I'll come into that shortly. The device ID, which identifies the device itself. And finally, the transaction counter, which identifies at what transaction is the device on. Now, every time a device performs a transaction, it increments the counter. It starts from 1, then 2, it generates unique keys for 2, then 3, it generates different keys, then 4, and so on and so forth. And then the KSN is also a seed of that key generation process. So as part of the cryptography that the device sends to the backend, it also sends the KSN. Now, when that payload gets to the backend, it gives the backend some information, some metadata on how to arrive to the keys that were used to encrypt this payload, so that it can be able to decrypt it. One, the KSN has the BDK ID. Now, the BDK itself is kept on the backend, but it's encrypted, but it is there. That BDK ID tells the backend exactly what BDK was used. So you can keep more than one BDK if you wanted to. So that just identifies the specific BDK that was used. The device ID, and then the transaction counter, which is at what count is the device currently on. Now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the KSN is also a seed for generating these keys. So what the backend does is, first it will generate an IPAC, just like the HSM had, and then it will generate future keys. And then it will generate from those future keys the encryption keys at that specific counter. So in this case, the backend could be the acquirer. That's how that management scheme works in more or less from a technical detail. Now, there is a deeper technical detail, but I think this is pretty much more or less covers what you would need to know if it was something of interest to you.